They tortured her in the dungeon for 170 days until she became the beast they feared. The dungeon of Castle Ebonheart was a place where light feared to tread. Its walls were carved from cold stone, blackened by centuries of neglect, and damp with the whispers of countless souls who had been forgotten there. Lady Seraphine had been held in this dark underworld for what felt like eternity, though the guards counted each day with precision. 170 days. 170 days of silence, fear, and endless watching eyes. She sat on the cold stone floor, knees drawn to her chest, fingers tracing the worn cracks of the wall. Outside her cell, torches sputtered, casting shadows that danced like the memories of all she had lost. Nobility, freedom, family. All vanished, leaving only the hollow echo of her own thoughts. She had once been the daughter of House Valemont, a family of dignity and influence, but the whispers of treason had dragged her down to this pit. Now she was no one. A shadow. A tool for cruel games she did not understand. Yet even in the suffocating darkness, a spark refused to die. Seraphine's eyes, pale and wide, shone with a strange light. It was not fear that glimmered there, but something else. Anger, resolve, and the faintest pulse of power that she did not yet name. She had felt it first in the early days, when despair threatened to swallow her. Whispers in the dungeon walls had seemed to answer her unspoken questions, and shadows had curled closer, almost in recognition of her presence. The guards brought food at irregular hours. Sometimes it was bread so hard it chipped her teeth. Sometimes it was water, muddy and cold. They never looked at her directly. Their eyes darted, fearful as though she carried some unseen threat. And perhaps she did. Dens. She had begun to notice that even the rats in the dungeon would pause and stare at her. She did not move them, did not call them. They simply acknowledged her, as if they knew she was no longer merely human. Or perhaps they were the first to see the change that was quietly blooming within her. Seraphine had learned to speak to herself aloud, to keep her mind from cracking. She recited poems from memory, sang fragments of songs she had heard as a girl, and sometimes whispered names she had not dared to say for months. Her parents, her brother, her old friends. Audacious, and yet there were nights when she could not summon them. Nights when despair crept so close that the spark of power seemed the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Then, on the 170th day, something changed. The silence of the dungeon shifted. It was subtle at first, a whisper that carried through the stone, a coldness that was sharper than the damp. And then, a voice. It spoke her name, low and soft, almost melodic yet impossible to ignore. Seraphine! She froze. Chest. Her heart thundered in her chest. No guard had ever called her by name. The voice was not the voice of man or woman. It was something older, something deeper, curling around her mind like smoke. "Who's there?" she asked, though her voice sounded small in the vastness of the dungeon. Silence answered, and then the voice again, closer this time. Des. You are not what they believe you are. You are more, stronger. Seraphine pressed herself against the wall, fear and awe warring in her chest. For months she had believed she was powerless, that this dungeon had consumed her entirely. Yet here was proof that she was more than the world had allowed her to be. Her thoughts turned immediately to Lord Caelan. He had been the one shadowed figure in the court who had noticed her, not in pity, but in curiosity, in cautious respect. He had watched her through the corridors, whispered in half-words when no one else was near, and though she despised the manipulations of the court, she could not deny the strange pull she felt toward him. He had never entered the dungeon, never risked the king's wrath for her sake, yet she imagined him here, sensing her, feeling her transformation, longing for what he dared not seek, but the voice in the darkness was no Caelan. It was something else entirely. something unworldly. It promised power, hinted at secrets older than the castle itself. And it offered a choice. Will you remain broken, it whispered, or will you become the force they all fear? She could feel the energy stirring beneath her skin, a trembling fire that had been growing with every insult, every lie, every night spent alone. The dungeon had not broken her. It had shaped her, sharpened her, prepared her. And now the choice lay before her. Surrender to despair, or embrace the darkness within. The next morning the guards arrived to bring her food, expecting the same trembling figure they had watched for months. They found her sitting upright, chin lifted, eyes glowing faintly with an inner light that made them hesitate. One of the younger guards shivered and looked away. You seem changed," he stammered, though no words could capture what had shifted in her presence. Seraphine said nothing. Instead, she let the silence stretch. A subtle wave of command rolled through the room. Not loud or violent, but undeniable. The guards instinctively stepped back, uneasy, unsure if they had imagined the sensation that prickled their skin. By the end of the day, Seraphine began testing her newfound abilities. Desks, shadows moved subtly when she willed them. Whispers carried across the stone corridors in her voice alone. Small animals that had wandered into the dungeon paused to look at her, as if they recognized her sovereignty. She was no longer simply a prisoner. She was something more. Yet with this power came the weight of responsibility and danger. If she revealed too much, the court would seek her destruction. If she held too little, she would remain a victim, a ghost of the girl she had been. She spent hours in contemplation, whispering to herself, planning, imagining. Each day became a practice of control. Every emotion, every spark of fear or anger became a tool. She did not desire vengeance yet, but she understood it could be hers, if she chose to wield it. And the thought of seeing Kaelin again, of showing him the woman she had become, sent a thrill through her that she could barely contain. As the night deepened, the dungeon seemed to close in tighter. Her cell was smaller, darker. But now, it was not oppressive. It was a laboratory. A place where she tested her mind, her endurance, and the strange powers that hummed beneath her skin. Then, just as she was beginning to feel the hunger of freedom, the voice returned. "You will not remain here forever," it said, a note of both promise and warning threading the words. "But know this, when you emerge, you will not be the girl they once feared. You will be the force they all dread. And the world will bend in ways you cannot yet imagine." Seraphine's heart raced. She had felt fear before, but this was different. This was anticipation. This was the pulse of power that filled her veins, the promise of transformation she had longed for, even in her darkest hours. Bess. She closed her eyes and let the whispers of the dungeon wash over her, letting the shadows guide her thoughts, breaking slow but deliberate, dangerous but precise. She was no longer a pawn, a prisoner, or a ghost. She was becoming the storm that would remake the kingdom itself. And yet, there was a flicker of hesitation, a tiny ember of her old self, a reminder of the girl who had once dreamed beneath sunlit skies. Could she balance the monster and the human? Could she retain the heart that still longed for kindness, even as she embraced the power that would terrify the world? The answer, she knew, would come soon. The torches sputtered and dimmed. The cold stones seemed to breathe around her. In the shadow of her cell, the voice whispered one final word for the night: rise. And in that single word, Seraphine felt something break. Not her spirit, but the last thread that had bound her to helplessness. The dungeon had tested her. The world had tried to crush her. And now, on the eve of a new day, she would awaken, not as the girl they had imprisoned, but as the beast they feared. The castle above slept, unaware of the storm stirring in its depths. The morning light barely pierced the thick walls of Castle Ebonheart, yet it fell upon Seraphine's face with a strange, almost sacred glow. She had spent the night listening, learning, feeling the rhythm of the dungeon, and the whispers that had promised power now seemed to pulse through her veins like a living thing. Her hair, once soft and untamed, now lay in shadowed waves, catching faint light that seemed to bend around her. Her eyes, pale and steady, reflected the quiet fire that had grown inside her, a fire she had not dared to name until now. She rose from the stone floor, stretching her limbs, testing the strength she had earned through months of torment. The dungeon had not loosened its chains. Guards still prowled the corridors above, and the king's spies could be anywhere, but Seraphine no longer felt fear in the way she had once known it. Fear had transformed into something sharper, awareness, patience, and the keen edge of strategy. She focused on the shadows in her cell, willing them to move in her presence. A faint ripple ran across the floor, subtle enough that a careless eye might miss it, yet undeniable to her senses. A rat, scuttling along the damp wall, froze and looked at her with unblinking eyes. Then, almost reverently, it turned and vanished into a crack in the stone. If she could bend shadows and command fear even in these small ways, what might she do when she walked freely again? She did not yet hunger for vengeance, though the thought sometimes flickered in the corners of her mind. Desperate, she hungered for control, for recognition, for the ability to shape her own destiny. And perhaps, if fate allowed, the chance to confront those who had imprisoned her. Her first test beyond shadows came with Kaelin. He had returned to the castle, though the reason was hidden, and he moved through the halls like a whisper. He was a young lord with eyes that carried both ambition and secret regret. He had been sent to watch her, to report, perhaps even to manipulate. And yet, he hesitated, as if sensing the change in her before he saw it. The first time they met in the library, it was accidental, or perhaps fate had arranged it. Seraphine had slipped into the forgotten stacks, seeking a moment of solitude. Books lined the walls, dusty and ancient, some older than the castle itself. She traced her fingers along the spines, feeling the weight of knowledge in her touch. A shadow moved behind her. "You shouldn't be here," Kaelin said, his voice low, careful, as if speaking too loudly might alert the castle itself. "Psst." Seraphine did not turn. "And yet I am," she replied, calm, almost daring. "Do you always follow the weak, Lord Kaelin?" He stiffened, his hand instinctively brushing against the hilt of his dagger, but she did not flinch. She had learned courage, and now something beyond courage. She had learned presence. Even Kaelin, trained in courtly cunning and the politics of survival, felt it. "You are changed," he said finally, meeting her gaze. "Something stronger. I do not know if I should fear you or admire you." Seraphine allowed herself a faint smile. Perhaps both. The library became their secret meeting place over the following weeks. Kaelin would bring whispers from the castle above, news of court intrigues and whispered plots. In return, Seraphine shared little, letting her silence speak louder than words. Her mind had sharpened into clarity and precision. She began to test the extent of her powers. Desks, shadows could cloak her movements. Whispers could carry her intent, and sometimes, in moments of stillness, the walls themselves seemed to lean toward her, listening, responding, acknowledging the rise of something new. Yet, the bond with Kaelin was a delicate thing. He represented both temptation and danger. She could feel his admiration, his conflicted loyalty, and the flicker of something deeper, perhaps even affection. And in her heart she felt a strange yearning, a hope that someone could understand the storm that was building inside her. But she could not forget the cruelty of the world above. The same man who whispered of loyalty might still betray her if it suited him. One evening, as rain battered the castle walls and the wind howled through the towers, Cullen arrived with a grave look. "They speak of you above," he said, voice tight. "The court. They are afraid. They fear what you have become, and they may act soon." Seraphine listened, calm. Fear had become a tool, not a master. "Let them fear," she said quietly. "Let them see only what I allow them to see, and let them underestimate the woman they imprisoned." Kaelin hesitated. "And me? Do I trust you?" Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "Trust is earned. But know this, if you betray me, I will not just survive breaths. I will endure. I will rise, and I will never forget." The tension between them was electric, a mixture of desire, admiration, and caution. They were allies, bound by circumstance and curiosity, yet the rules of power loomed over every interaction. Seraphine knew she could not afford to be naive, even in the presence of someone as seemingly loyal as Colin. Her next step was to test her powers beyond the dungeon. At night, when the castle slept, she would move unseen through the corridors, listening to whispered plots, discovering secrets hidden in the stone. She learned that her influence extended beyond mere illusion. Fear responded to her presence. Men and women alike hesitated when she entered a room. The court had not known how to perceive her, and that was her advantage. But the court was not the only danger. Her own power was unpredictable. Sometimes shadows would writhe without her intention. Whispers would rise like voices of the dead. She began to understand that mastery required not just strength, but patience, restraint, and self-knowledge. She was no longer the frightened girl who had spent nights counting the cracks in her cell wall. She was a force, cunning, perceptive, and growing stronger with each passing day. And yet, in quiet moments, she still remembered the girl she had been. She remembered warmth, sunlight, laughter, fleeting things she thought she might never see again. Those memories were bittersweet, a tether to humanity that she refused to sever. The beast within could rise, but it must not consume all she had been. One night, Kaelin entered the library as she pored over old maps of the surrounding lands. Rain streaked the windows, thunder rolling in the distance. "He have something for you," he said, pressing a small note into her hand. It was sealed with wax, the mark of the court. Seraphine's eyes narrowed as she broke the seal. The note contained warnings, plots, names of those who sought her downfall, and subtle suggestions of loyalty and betrayal. She read it slowly, absorbing every detail. Her pulse did not quicken with fear. Bask. It quickened with purpose. "You see?" Kaelin said softly, almost nervously. "They are watching. They are waiting. Ben Est. And some want you destroyed." Seraphine folded the note carefully. "Let them watch," she said. "Let them wait. By the time they move, I will already have risen, and the beast will be awake." Kaelin studied her face, the faint glow in her eyes, the calm determination that had replaced the tremor of fear he once knew. He knew he was no longer dealing with the girl they had tortured. He was dealing with someone else entirely, someone both frightening and magnificent. That night, Seraphine moved through the castle corridors, testing her control. Shadows followed her command, whispers carried her warnings, and even the wind seemed to bend toward her will. She was learning to move through the world as more than human, as someone untouchable and unseen until she allowed herself to be known. Yet, the court would not remain passive, and Kaelin, despite his admiration and careful loyalty, carried secrets of his own. Seraphine could feel it, the shift in his tone, the hesitation in his words. Death. She did not yet understand the depth of it, but she knew instinctively that trust was fragile, and betrayal could come from the one closest to her. The storm outside mirrored the storm within her. The castle trembled under the wind, and Seraphine's heart mirrored the rhythm of her awakening power. Fear, patience, cunning, these were no longer just survival tools. They were weapons. And then, as she paused in the library, listening to the rain, a faint echo reached her ears. It was not the wind, not the rain. It was a voice, low, deliberate, whispering her name with a note of recognition and challenge. Seraphine turned, eyes glowing faintly in the dark, and spoke aloud, steady and commanding. "I am awake." The castle, silent and brooding, seemed to respond. Shadows shifted in acknowledgement, and somewhere, deep within the stone walls, a presence stirred, watching, waiting, and recognizing that the girl they had imprisoned was no longer a prisoner. The first step of her rise had begun. The forest beyond Castle Ebonheart was ancient, silent, and wild. Trees twisted skyward like the fingers of forgotten spirits, their leaves dark as midnight. The air was thick with the scent of moss and rain, and shadows clung to every stone and root. Seraphine had fled here, leaving the castle behind, leaving Kaelin behind, leaving the court and their whispers of fear. She ran not out of cowardice but necessity. She had become something they feared, and the world above would never understand her, nor forgive her. She walked barefoot along the damp earth, feeling every root, every stone, every pulse of life beneath her feet. The dungeon had taught her endurance. The castle had taught her strategy, and now the forest would teach her patience, control, and the subtle ways of the wild. Even here, however, she was not alone. The shadows that had once whispered to her in stone now moved in the trees. Animals, wolves, owls, and small, unseen creatures sensed her presence and kept their distance, watching, waiting. Sometimes, in the hush of twilight, she could swear the trees themselves bent slightly toward her, welcoming her. It was here that she first met the fallen queen. She appeared from the mist, regal yet broken, a woman draped in the remnants of once gilded robes, eyes sharp with wisdom and sorrow. Her presence was both terrifying and comforting, like fire held just out of reach. "You are the one they fear," the queen said, voice like wind over stone. "I have seen you in shadows and whispers. You carry a power they cannot understand. But beware, power without control is a curse, not a gift." "Who are you?" "Names are fragile," the queen replied. "I am someone who has walked the path you now tread. I was once what you will become if you are not careful, strong, feared, alone. I survived, barely, and I will teach you to survive too." For days, perhaps weeks, Seraphine trained under the queen's guidance. First, she learned to bend fear not only in others but in herself. She practiced control over the shadows and whispers that had first awakened in the dungeon. She discovered how to harness them, channel them, make them extensions of her will. The forest became a classroom, the mist her mentor, and the wind her teacher. Through it all, her mind could not escape Kaelin. She wondered if he had betrayed her, or if he still carried some loyalty to her. She feared that the man she had once glimpsed in fleeting moments of connection could now be her enemy. Yet, in quiet moments, she longed for him, despite everything. She hated herself for this longing. But even beasts, even ones feared by kings, could not escape the ache of loneliness. And then the message arrived. It came not by messenger, not by scroll, but through the whispering wind, carrying words sharp and cold. "The king intends to hunt you. They fear the power you now wield. If you do not return, they will destroy everything you hold dear, including the memory of your name." Seraphine's pulse quickened, though her face remained calm. The king, the court, the castle, they believed they could destroy her. Yet she was no longer the girl they had imprisoned. We was the storm beneath the stone, the whisper in the shadows, the beast that they had awakened by fear alone. She stood on a ridge, looking down at the distant towers of Ebonheart. Rain had washed the castle walls, and the wind carried the faint echoes of voices and torches. For the first time, Seraphine understood the full scope of her transformation. She could not hide. She could not flee. She had to act, not as a frightened girl, but as a force that could command fear and respect in equal measure. Kylan appeared again, though she had not called him. His figure emerged from the trees, cautious yet unmistakably him. His eyes were wide, filled with awe and something else. Guilt, perhaps, or hope. "You came," she said, voice low, steady, commanding. "I had to," he said, stepping closer. "I should have come sooner. I should have protected you. But I am here now." Seraphine studied him. The boy who had once observed her from the shadows was now a man, yet still flawed, still human. She could see the hesitation in his movements, the unspoken truth that he had once betrayed her in the castle, enough to reveal a portion of her power to the court. That betrayal had nearly shattered her, and yet she did not strike him down. "Not yet. Do you trust me?" Kaelin asked, the question trembling between them like a fragile thread. "I trust what you can prove," Seraphine said, her tone unreadable. "Trust is earned, not given."
"And you have much to prove." The tension between them was a living thing.
Each glance, each word carried unspoken promises and threats. She could feel his loyalty and his fear, and she knew that the smallest misstep could ignite a war between them, or cement an alliance stronger than steel. The next days were a test of strength, cunning, and emotional endurance. Seraphine taught Kaelin what the forest could reveal, how to read the shadows, how to hear the unspoken truths in whispers of wind, how to sense danger before it arrived. And Kaelin in turn shared knowledge of the castle, the court, and the vulnerabilities of those who sought her destruction.
Yet, even as they grew closer, a shadow of betrayal lingered.
Seraphine could feel the subtle hesitation in his movements, the flicker of guilt in his gaze. She did not yet forgive him entirely. Forgiveness was a path she had not yet walked, but she could temper the beast within with purpose, and she could temper herself with patience. Then the attack came. It was not a battle of swords, but of fear. A group from the castle had tracked her to the forest, believing that even here she could be captured. But Seraphine had prepared bests. Shadows moved as if alive, whispering voices rising and falling with the wind. Wolves, drawn by her presence, circled and howled, and trees seemed to shift to block paths, guiding intruders into confusion. The intruders panicked. Fear spread faster than knowledge or reason. They saw not a girl, but a force of nature. A beast. And in their terror, they fled, leaving Seraphine and Kaelin standing in the mist. "You are terrifying," Kaelin said, voice low, almost reverent. "I am not yet finished," she replied, a quiet fire in her eyes. "I am still learning, still rising." "And they will all learn to fear what they once thought weak." Kaelin studied her, his admiration mingled with fear. He had glimpsed the full extent of her transformation, the strength, the control, the calculated mastery of power. And yet, beneath it, he sensed the flicker of the girl she once was, the humanity she still carried despite the beast within. The forest, alive with shadows and whispers, seemed to agree. Trees swayed, the wind shifted, and even the mist seemed to curl protectively around her. She had become one with the wild, and one with the power that had begun in the dungeon, nurtured in secret, and now awakened fully. But the danger was far from over. The king would not relent. The court would not forget the fear she inspired. And the beast within her, though controlled, still hungered for acknowledgment, for recognition, for the justice denied to her in stone and shadow. The queen, the fallen monarch who had taught her to temper power with patience, appeared once more in the forest, silent as a shadow at the edge of a clearing. "Remember this," the queen said, her eyes piercing. "Fear is a tool, not a master. Power without purpose will consume you before it strikes your enemies. Choose carefully, child. The path you walk is narrow, and betrayal waits in every shadow." Seraphine nodded, understanding. The path of the beast was not simple. It was fraught with risk, temptation, and loneliness. But it was the only path that could lead her to freedom, and perhaps to redemption, if she survived. That night, as she stood atop a ridge looking at the distant glow of Castle Ebonheart through the mist, Seraphine made a vow. She would confront the king and the court. She would command the fear they had given her, and she would rise not only as the beast they feared, but as the woman she was meant to become. And somewhere in the darkness, Kalen lingered, torn between loyalty and ambition. He had seen the storm that Seraphine was becoming, and he knew that the next move, whether it united them or tore them apart, would decide the fate of them both. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a promise of power, of danger, and of change. And deep within the shadows a presence stirred, watching, waiting, as though the world itself recognized that the girl they had imprisoned had become a force no one could ignore. Dawn broke over Castle Ebonheart like a pale, reluctant fire. The walls, once imposing, now seemed brittle beneath the storm that had gathered beyond their gates. Seraphine stood on a ridge overlooking the castle, cloaked in the shadows of early light. The messenger's warning had been clear: return or perish. But Seraphine did not feel fear. Fear had been her companion in the dungeon, her shadow in the corridors, and even in the wild forests. Now, fear was a tool, sharpened and ready to strike through the hearts of those who had once sought to destroy her. She had transformed. Bite, she had endured, and she had risen. Kylan appeared beside her, as quiet as a shadow. He had followed, unbidden yet necessary, guided by loyalty and the fragile thread of trust they had built in the forest. His eyes held both awe and worry, but he no longer looked at her as a frightened girl. He saw the force she had become, a storm wrapped in human form, delicate yet unyielding. "You're certain about this?" he asked softly, voice barely above the wind. "Once you step into the castle, there's no turning back." The people who had tormented her, the court that had whispered of curses and death, the king who had branded her a threat, all would face the power she had nurtured in silence. "I am ready," she said, calm and commanding. Not as the girl they imprisoned, but as the storm they feared would never rise. The first step was subtle. Shadows began to ripple around her feet as she descended the ridge toward the castle gates. The wind seemed to bend toward her, carrying whispers that unsettled the soldiers on patrol. Even the birds scattered in sudden panic, as if sensing the force awakening within her. Kalen walked beside her, silent, knowing that he could not shield her entirely. This was a test of power, of courage, of the precision she had honed over months of isolation and training. Burst. Inside the castle, the halls were alive with tension. Guards glanced at each other nervously, whispers spreading like wildfire. "She has returned. The girl. The beast. She walks among us." Descendane. Seraphine's footsteps were deliberate, each movement calculated, each glance a silent declaration. She did not need to strike. The fear she carried with her was enough. Shadows curled at her heels, subtle and threatening, and every whisper of her voice seemed amplified by the ancient stones. The first encounter came in the great hall. The king, seated on his throne, rose as she entered. His eyes widened, surprise, fear, disbelief all flickering across his face. He had expected a frightened girl, a shadow of what she once was. Instead, he faced a force of nature, poised and unyielding. "Seraphine," he said, voice steady but strained. "You should not have returned. You should have feared me sooner," she replied softly, each word precise, each syllable weighted with authority. "I am not the girl you imprisoned. I am what you created when you chose cruelty over mercy." The court shifted uneasily. Nobles murmured, unsure if the words were threat or truth. Seraphine's eyes swept the hall, taking in every figure, noting every hesitation. She did not need weapons. Her presence was weapon enough. Kalen stepped forward. "They cannot harm her," he said, voice steady now, infused with loyalty that had been earned in the forest. "Bass, she is no longer yours to control. She is her own in the power she carries. You cannot comprehend." Dagger. A reflex born of fear. Seraphine's eyes narrowed, and the shadows shifted at her command, curling around the dagger like a living thing. The king froze, eyes wide as the weapon clattered harmlessly to the floor. "Do you see?" she said, calm but dangerous. "This is what you feared, not a girl. Breaths, not weakness. Me." It was then that the court realized the truth. She had become more than human, more than mortal, yet still fully herself. The transformation was complete. She had mastered the beast within, tempered it with patience, and directed it with precision. But Seraphine's power was not only fear. Beneath the strength, the shadows, and the whispers lay humanity. The same spark that had endured the dungeon, the court, and the wild forests. She could destroy them all, yes, but she chose purpose over vengeance, wisdom over impulse. Her rise was not only survival, it was a declaration of justice. Kalen approached her side, placing a hand lightly on her arm. "You do not need to do this alone," he said. "We can change this kingdom together." Her eyes softened briefly. "Perhaps," she admitted, "but first, I must show them what they have created." "Psst," Seraphine's voice rose, calm but resolute, as she demanded truth and justice. The court listened, trapped between fear and awe. She did not rage, she did not plead. She commanded presence, and her words carried the weight of survival, endurance, and awakening. And yet, even as the king faltered, Kalen's presence reminded her that she was not entirely alone. Their bond, forged in danger, tempered by shared struggle, gave her balance. She had learned to temper power with restraint and love with caution. The man who once hesitated now stood beside her, a witness and a partner in her rise. The court, confronted with undeniable power and truth, had no choice but to yield. Nobles bowed, soldiers stepped aside, and the king, stripped of his certainty, sank back onto the throne. Seraphine had reclaimed her destiny, not through brute force but through mastery of fear, shadow, and presence. And yet, as the hall fell silent, Seraphine understood that her journey was not over. Power always attracts challenge, and the whispers of darkness that had guided her awakening hinted at forces older than the castle itself. But she did not falter. Dens. She had endured the dungeon, the forest, and the betrayal of trust. She had faced the beast within, and emerged as both human and legend. In the quiet aftermath, Kalen spoke softly. "What now?" Seraphine turned, eyes reflecting the strength she had claimed and the spark of the girl she had been. "Now," she said, "we build. We lead, we shape what comes next, not as victims, not as pawns, but as rulers of our own destiny. The court watched, uncertain, but they understood that the girl they had feared was gone. In her place stood a force beyond fear, tempered with wisdom, tempered with humanity, tempered with love. The kingdom had been changed forever. The final moment came as Seraphine stood on the balcony overlooking the castle grounds. The wind carried the whispers of the past, the dungeon, the betrayal, the forest, and they swirled around her like memories that had been forged into strength. Kaelin stood beside her, steady, unshakable, and their hands brushed, a silent acknowledgement of trust and shared fate. She smiled faintly. Not for victory, not for power, but for the quiet joy of knowing she had endured, transformed, and risen. And as the sun broke fully over the horizon, touching the towers of Castle Ebonheart with golden light, a subtle, unseen presence stirred in the shadows. The whispers hinted at forces older than the kingdom, older than the castle, and older than fear itself. But Seraphine did not flinch. She had faced darkness before, and she had risen. She would rise again, if need be. The beast they had feared was awake, but it was no longer a monster. It was a queen. And in that moment, the castle, the kingdom, and the world knew that she had become something unstoppable. Not because she sought destruction, but because she had endured, transformed, and embraced the power within her. The journey that had begun in the darkness of a dungeon had ended in light tempered by shadow, strength tempered by love, and power tempered by wisdom. Breath. Seraphine had risen, and with Kaelin by her side she would shape the future. A future where fear no longer ruled, but justice, endurance, and hope prevailed. The wind whispered through the towers one last time that day, carrying both warning and promise. The legend of the girl who had become the beast, the queen who had risen, had only just begun.